Welcome to episode 268 of School Librarians United. I'm your host, Amy Herman. This podcast is dedicated to the issues and challenges school librarians face every day. As a school librarian in my 17th year, I knew I wanted a podcast which addressed the nuts and bolts of running a successful library program. I don't claim to have the answers, but I hope that this is a platform to share resources and exchange ideas. Now is a perfect time to mention that all the ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast by myself, my interview guests, and listeners who reach out to the podcast are our own and do not reflect those of our school districts. When incorporating research, I always make sure to cite my sources. So whether you are a novice or a veteran school librarian, this podcast is something for you. Friends, I hope you consider sending in your voice messages to schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. Your recording will be included in the very next episode. Visit today's show notes for 24 prompts and the instructions for submitting your voice messages to be on the show. You don't want to miss our very next book club. Jarred Amato, creator of Project Lit, has a newly released book. Just read it. Unlocking the Magic of Independent Reading in Middle and High School Classrooms. I will be posting discussion questions in the next few weeks on social media and linked in future episode show notes. Listeners are welcome to either send in their voice message responses or join the podcast in recording our conversation to share in an upcoming episode in May. Check out the link in today's show notes. Amanda Jones's upcoming book, That Librarian, will be available starting on August 27th, but you can pre-order your copy now. And if you use the indie bookseller Cavalier House Books in Amanda's hometown of Denham Springs, Louisiana, you will get a signed copy. I've included a link in the show notes. When you look at the cover of Amanda's book, you might recognize the Freedom Fighter shirt that she's wearing. She reached out to the designer, Christy, who then designed a line of That Librarian apparel as well as That Librarian flair, such as a bag, sticker, and mug. I love that we can all be that librarian who advocates for our library and our students' access to books. It happens to be my most favorite thing to wear when I go to district meetings, when I speak in front of the staff, and anytime I feel like everyone needs to remember that our building has a librarian. You will find a link in today's show notes to the online store. Please know that 15% of the proceeds go to the Texas Library Association, as that is the home state of the designer. I welcome you and all listeners to reach out with your feedback and episode suggestions. You can reach me either on Facebook, on X, formerly known as Twitter. My handle is at LMS_United. On Threads, you can find me at School Librarians United, and on Blue Sky at SLU Podcast, or the email address schoollibrariansunited@gmail.com. If you include your mailing address, I'll be sure to send you a podcast sticker. Be sure to listen to episode 224. I announce a sponsorship with Literati Book Fairs. And now a chance to hear from one of Literati's team members, Jenny. Jenny Powell, welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Amy.
Would you, just for listeners tuning in and perhaps maybe missing your last introduction, would you give listeners an idea of what is it you do for Literati?
I'm the design lead of our book fairs team, so I help design and produce all of the materials that we put out for all of our book fair themes season after season.
Fantastic. Do you have a favorite visual element that you've helped create for the Literati Book Fair?
That's hard. I'm so passionate about design, but I think my favorite thing that I've helped to create for a Literati Book Fair would be our Secrets of the Sea Book Fair logo. I really geek out about typography, and I was really proud of the work that we did for that season. The logo is a little whimsical and nautical and exactly what I envisioned for that theme. And I also really love working on the posters that we do every season. They're super fun and feature our themed illustrator work, but I also showcase a few books that will be at the fairs.
Well, and I know that when those boxes of promo materials come, it's sort of like a real sneak preview to the kinds of things for many of us. We're looking at those posters going, oh, those are some of the books that we're going to have on the shelves. That's fantastic. And I know that it's not unusual for the books that are on the posters to be, flying off the bookcase as soon as the kids walk into the fair. Can I ask, because I do not know, what's typography?
That's a great question. I might be using some insider lingo here. So typography, when I say that, I mean the fonts that we're using for our logo and that we use on all of our bookcase signage. when you see something like easy readers on a bookcase, the font choice that we use for that signage, we take into account and make sure that it ladders up to our theme aesthetically every season.
I was hoping I was sort of like using context clues to figure out what was it. But, I appreciate that because as a non-artist, I could spend a great deal of time unnecessarily obsessing over the font that I choose. And I appreciate that there's a great deal of science that goes into how accessible this is for even some of our littlest readers. Thank you so much, Jenny. I hope you come back again and let us know a little bit more about what Literati does to help school librarians every day.
Thank you, Amy.
Friends, be sure to tune in to learn all about Literati and their very generous offer. Librarians who book their very first Literati Book Fair and mention the code UNITED when booking may qualify to receive a $500 gift card to Titlewave. Visit the link in today's show notes and call the Literati team to see if you qualify. And now a word from our sponsor, Capstone. Capstone is an innovative publisher and education technology provider of children's content for school libraries, classrooms, and at-home learning. Home of the award-winning PebbleGo research database, Capstone has a passion for creating inspired learning and intellectual curiosity in children, and I'm so excited to be working with them. I'm also grateful to Capstone for their continued commitment to support the podcast in Season 6. They are offering listeners of School Librarians United a very special discount. Visit shop.capstonepub.com and use the code UNITED to get $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and Capstone interactive ebooks. That's code UNITED for $20 off an order of $100 or more for both print and ebooks on shop.capstonepub.com. Friends, before we get started, I did want to give you some context for this episode on copyright. In many ways, this particular topic has been, for me, my white whale, that elusive interview, staring back at me on a list of episode topics that I generated years ago. I have draft outlines on copyright going back to as early as February 2020, and more than a few email invitations which never materialized into any solid plans to record. I am very grateful to Carrie Russell, our guest today, and to ALA Editions, who generously provided books which have given me the foundation for several of our recent episodes. And now for today's episode, Complete Copyright, and my conversation with Carrie Russell. Carrie Russell, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Friends, we usually begin our conversations with learning about your library, the grades you support, a little bit about your programming. But in this case, you are retired?
Yes, I am a librarian. My background as a librarian was in academic libraries. And then after like 15 years of that, I went to D.C. and became kind of a staffer for librarians in a way, as I was their lobbyist and policy person. But I would often be in meetings when I was in D.C. with all these attorneys, some pretty high-powered people from, Warner Brothers or some huge studio, and they'd go around and say who they were, and you knew all of them were lawyers, and then they'd come to me, and I'd say, hey, I'm Carrie, I'm a librarian. Then the room would go silent. But I thought, this is the most important thing about me that you need to know. I'm a librarian. So I have a particular attitude about copyright. But it was, it ended up being fine. I mean, once you get to know people, they lots of times you don't need to be a lawyer. Seriously. If you're in a court of law, of course you do.
But in terms of your wheelhouse, this is your expertise. We are going to be discussing a book that you have now released a second edition to, Complete Copyright for K-12 Librarians and Educators. This is your second edition. The first one came out, I think, 11 years ago. Is that correct?
That sounds right.
Okay. We are incredibly fortunate. An episode on copyright has been my white whale, an elusive topic which seems to scare many away. Over the years, I have made multiple overtures to people to speak on this topic, and it's never resulted in a recording until today. You have become incredibly well-versed in copyright. The book that you published came out originally 11 years ago. This is an updated edition. Can I just ask you, when you went to make those updates, can you identify what distinguishes your second edition from your first edition, if I can ask?
Sure. Well, my second edition has a lot more updates to like the legislative history and regulations that have been put in place since the first edition came out. It's got a little bit more about digital, more about licensing, but mostly it was, I think, an additional set of policy, justifications for what was going on with copyright law.
Fantastic. And friends, ALA Edition sent me this copy, and I was like, all right, now I have to find this author, and we're hopefully going to sit down and have a conversation. So I'm so grateful you're here. When it comes to copyright, it seems like you have this expertise. At what point in your career did you feel you had a book in you?
Well, I'd been doing, some copyright stuff even when I was an academic librarian, and that's where my interest started. So I did just like a whole bunch of reading. I went to every workshop I could go to. And then when I was hired by ALA, after about 5 years, I thought, there's a book here I can write. And I wanted to do it for ALA editions because it would support the association because, we need money. So I felt like after like 5 years, I used to go out and talk to people, do little presentations. And my first attempts, I think, were a little bit too political for people. And people would kind of argue with me, like, don't you like authors? Yeah, I love authors. I'm just telling you that this is how we have to look at copyright because we're librarians. And I guess I was just a little bit too political for people. And then I kind of shifted and kind of became more policy oriented. This is why we have copyright law. This is why Congress said this, that, and the other. This is why we have a long term, just stuff like that. Because I think what's missing for librarians is not understanding why do we have this law and why is it so, hard and goofy and ridiculous. And the reasons behind the law are really very good reasons. It's like copyright laws exist to benefit the public, to ensure that information is created and disseminated, really important, disseminated, because when the founders of the country started working on copyright laws, they were very concerned about censorship because that was the norm in England at the time. Censorship was such that the Queen could decide what was published and what could not be published. The publishers were in like a little gentleman's group, and they agreed to do what the Queen said, and they owned the copyright. And so a lot of information was never printed. And the founders said, we want everybody to know everything about everything. We want them to know about the laws. We want them to know about, how to make milk. How about everything? How does the post office work? How does this? And the post office was like so major for the founders because they really believed in access to information. And that's where our copyright law came from. Give the people the knowledge so that they can think and make their decisions, be well-informed in a democracy. That was their big scene. And it was different, than what they were used to, but they thought it would work out better.
The original civil libertarians.
Yeah.
I was so relieved when you wrote, quote, librarians and teachers are not to blame in having these misconceptions. Information distributed to librarians over the years has been wrong or incomplete and often conflicting, end quote. You spell out the 5 commonly held misconceptions about copyright. Could you break these misconceptions down in the context of school librarians doing their jobs?
Sure, I could try. The first thing is for school librarians, there's a feeling like, man, I better get this right. I'm dealing with the law and I'm dealing with people's, rights and everything. I'm a librarian, but, how can I work with copyright law and make sure I'm doing it right? And it's more like a feeling like there's some kind of rule, there's some kind of magic rule out there that ensures you're doing it right. And then there's no rules. There's absolutely no rules. There's checklists and everything, but they don't mean anything. And a lot of those checklists were put out to help librarians figure out the copyright law because we were so stupid, we couldn't figure out the copyright law on our own. So checklists developed, 10% of a book can be copied, that kind of thing. And they weren't written by librarians. They were written oftentimes by publishers, and they didn't have anything to do with the law whatsoever. Now, I used to tell people that, and they would be like, "You're blowing my mind." No way. And it's like, yes, way. Now people kind of get that. And so the misconceptions lead to this, like, I got to get it right kind of thing. The first misconception is that people ought to be paid. If I'm going to photocopy this, article, is the author getting paid? I better make sure they're getting paid, kind of this onus on us to pay for things. Yes, authors do need to be paid, and they are paid. But the primary purpose of the copyright law is, as we stated, to advance knowledge and information for the public. It's for the public good. You won't hear that so often when you are at a hearing, Senate hearing or something. People will talk a lot about, the author, they need to get paid, they're getting ripped off. And this is true, they are, because of digital. But really, the main purpose is us, people, because they wanted people to be smart, the founders. The other thing that people think is that people are getting sued all the time. I used to give a presentation and people, first question, who's been sued? I heard that so-and-so got sued. Was this school district sued? Blah, blah, blah. And it's like, no one was sued. As the years went by, some people did get sued, but really there's not any kind of lawsuits. And people couldn't really believe that. But what is happening is when a school district was called and challenged on infringement, usually what the school district would do is settle out of court. So it kind of seems like they must have been doing something wrong if they settled out of court. But if they had litigated that infringement action, they might not have been infringing. And there's reasons, a lot of reasons why librarians and school teachers are not going to be sued. The law has these little limitations just for us. So it's not really in the interest of rights holders to sue librarians. For one thing, they cannot collect statutory damages. So that's where the big money is. So they can only collect actual damages, which are minor. Librarians and school teachers have exceptions in the law that allow them to do things that other people cannot do. And when you work for a state institution, you are protected by the 11th Amendment, which says that the federal courts cannot sue a state for money. So, a rights holder would have to be real darn sure that they were going to win a case because they don't have that much to work with. So it's really this notion that if you are an educator and you're in an environment where there's a lot of books and a lot of learning, you're going to use a lot of that stuff in order to promote learning. And some allowances are allowed for those people. It's kind of different. They recognize we would be using a lot of information that we might make mistakes, but we would do the best we could. So that was people were afraid they were going to get sued. I'm like, no, don't worry. The other thing that's a misconception is the whole term intellectual property, which I don't know. I think that was really an international term of copyright that, everybody started to use. But it's confusing because copyright is not property. A rights holder doesn't own all their books. They own rights. They hold rights that are given to them by Congress. So they have rights to do certain things with their books that no one else can do with their books. But they don't own them, which is an important distinction. In the olden days, people software industry, they used to send educational material to librarians and they'd say, well, it's just you wouldn't steal a car, would you? Well, copyright's not like stealing a car. If you make a copy, you have a copy. The other thing still exists. It doesn't exhaust itself. So it's not like a property kind of thing. Also, the no definitive rules is something that takes a while for people to understand. And finally, that fair use sounds hard, but fair use is your friend. Really, the only thing you need to understand is fair use. And you will be doing a really good job at work and for your patrons and for your teachers.
Awesome. And I know we're going to go into fair use in depth a little bit later in our conversation. I'd love for you to elaborate on something which I read and then I had to reread it. Quote, finally, librarians and teachers, in part to deal with the confusion, have surrendered to reliance on checklists. Checklists over time become copyright law to many people and greatly limit one's ability to teach, end quote.
Yes, this is when I started in this field. It was, it was a long time ago. And everybody had checklists. And the photocopy machine was like kind of the thing that was the infringing machine. So they had checklists that said you can copy 10% of a book, you can copy one chapter of a book, you can tape 5 minutes from a program, you can write down 10 lines of a poem, but no more than 10 lines, that kind of thing. And really, those are just arbitrary, made-up numbers. And if you think about it, they sound really silly because why is 10% okay when 8% might be infringing and 30% might be fair? So it's really to train, I feel like kind of to train librarians and teachers to not think and just follow these rules. And they're not in the interest of our patrons or in the interest of our school teachers because they're very limiting and they make people feel that they have a guarantee that they're not going to get in trouble when really they're just, they have no power in the courtroom. So if you went to court and said, hey, I only copied 10% of a book, they'd go, so what? We don't care about that. Where did you get this number? It's just made up stuff. And I think that people like the checklist because they like, yes, I can do that. No, I cannot do that. And say they can tell a teacher, well, the rule is this or that. It's so black and white rather than get into the nuances of fair use and whether or not something's lawful or not. And also kind of a laziness in a way that you don't have to think. You don't have to put your mind to this problem. Instead, you just have to look at this checklist, which is, silly. We're really going to ask you to think if you're going to use the copyright law.
I am so grateful I'm having a conversation with another librarian because I think it would be very easy to become defensive in this particular scenario, but I really am grateful for your expertise because, I have never invested a great deal of time in committing my bandwidth to learning about copyright. But as will become evident in the conversation that we're going to have, this is one that I've really been hoping to be able to share with somebody who appreciates not only all of the nuance when it comes to copyright, but also the demands of our jobs as librarians. So, I'm curious. I don't believe this was raised in your book. I'm fascinated to see how the educators and district administration grappled with the issue of copyright in the early months of the pandemic, because suddenly we were in very uncharted territories, and in some cases, copyright seemed to be waived, and permissions were being extended by authors and by teachers to share recordings of, say, read-alouds of books. And for a while, what was permissible while we were teaching remotely was now being, discussed at great length. And I thought that was great.
Yeah, the pandemic was really kind of opened everybody's eyes. Publishers and authors, as you said, understood the need to use information in ways that might be infringing. And so they wanted to help us out. And they said, under these conditions, you can go ahead and do this. Don't ask permission. It's okay to read aloud. Other people would argue that it's always okay to read aloud. It's silly to think that even that act is infringing. But people were concerned that if they read aloud, they'd get in trouble. So it was, in a way, a good thing that the publishers were lenient. But at the same time, librarians need to understand that maybe that leniency was not necessary, that they already had some of the rights the publisher said they were giving them. It was an extremely busy time, especially, I think, in the academic libraries. They did a lot of pushing the envelope in terms of using material, more so than like public librarians or school librarians, because they had so much material that was housed in these big libraries that nobody had access to. So someone might, ask for the full text of a book, and maybe some academic library would go, okay, I'll just go ahead and do it, and they just kind of pushed the envelope, and it led to like some interesting thinking about lending works in digital formats that right now is in litigation, and I could talk about that for a bit, but it led people to try new things. It also led people to think that what they were doing was wrong.
Carrie, I'm remembering, because at the time I was teaching in elementary libraries, and I know a lot of schools, not just at the elementary level, but also at the middle school level, would do read-alouds, and they would have, an entire staff take turns recording themselves reading a chapter of a book. And the sort of instructions from on high was, as long as we keep this in a closed platform that is accessible only by our users, like on our learning management systems, that this would be permissible. And even in that situation, I cringe, because if the staff members, and we would do this during the March's Reading Month or One School, One Book, where the teachers would each take a turn reading a chapter for the families who wouldn't necessarily be reading this book aloud. And I know that, there are real specifics around this, but my understanding is if you completely substitute another format, which nullifies the need to pay for an actual copy for your users, that is a violation of copyright.
Yes, in general, that's true. There are instances when making a copy is perfectly fine. For example, we make accessible copies for people with print disabilities. We read books in like kind of different ways for people that have learning disabilities. We read the whole thing to them. We don't even think about it. And the reading itself is a performance, and so that is like another exclusive right. But we do sometimes go ahead and put a whole new format out, maybe delete it after it's used. I think the notion of keeping it contained to the classroom environment is a good one, because there's some precedent for that in the law.
Again, it's very hard, because I'm like, wait, if you read the entire book out loud and you record it, all of a sudden, we don't even need to provide our students with a copy of this book. And some schools are good, but some schools are like, yeah, this is how we're celebrating March's Reading Month. And I'm like, you're violating copyright.
You know what the other thing was that was kind of complicated things was that there is a market for digital ebooks. By that time, people were paying for ebooks as well as print books. There was a market there. So the argument that we weren't really hurting the market was less strong. Also, there were authors that were doing their own readings on like YouTube. And they would be like, you can't do a reading. I'm doing my reading. You should come to my YouTube channel and see the reading and see my ads so I can get some money for this. And so that kind of complicated things too. In general, I would say if there's a real need to read aloud, and so often there is, and you keep it contained to the classroom, you're gonna be okay. You're not refusing to buy content. Like, I know there's some libraries that have done that, where they've taken a book, digitized it, and lent the digital version when a digital version exists in the marketplace. Clearly, you are violating one of the 4 factors of fair use. You're really having an influence on the market. If that behavior was widespread, authors would not get as much money as they're getting now. There's a lot of nuances that came up just at that time of the pandemic, because we were working through ebook licenses and, oh my goodness, a lot of fun stuff.
Chapter 3 is a deep dive into fair use, and I'm thinking the 4 factors are included on those checklists that we were discussing earlier. I have had teachers get really defiant and justify what they're doing just as this is for educational purposes.
Right.
As if teachers get a pass when it comes to copyright.
Yeah, and they don't. There is a factor in fair use that is the purpose of the use, the factor number 1, and that asks, is this use for nonprofit educational purposes? Like, I'm going to copy this article and give everybody an article in class. Is this for nonprofit educational purposes? Or is this for some monetary purpose, for-profit purposes? I'm going to sell the article on the street corner. But that is not one or the other. It's a continuum. So on one end, you could have something that was very, very for-profit kind of reason for using materials. And then on the other end, you could have something that was really not for profit and educational only. So there's a range there. When you think about fair use factors, you have to determine how you kind of stand in each of those factors on a continuum. They're not like yes or no. And so that's why people go, oh, it's educational, fine, I can do it. No, you are in a better position because it's educational to be able to do it, but you don't have a free pass because some educational uses can be infringing.
Well, and when it comes to the nature of the publication, you know, for me, I especially had an issue when a teacher said to me, Amy, I only have one copy of this play or of this, they had a magazine. And, you know, I just am making a copy for all of my students because I only have one copy.
And it makes sense. I mean, if I was a teacher, you know, you probably go like, well, why not? I mean, I want to do this lesson plan, right? But in terms of the nature of the publication, again, there's that continuum. On one end, something's published or something's unpublished. At the same time, something might be creative fiction, something might be a journal article, a map. Some things that are factual in nature and published are things that we can use a little bit more freely. Now, the magazine example, of course, it's got a lot of fictional, a lot of creative effort, a lot of pictures, a lot of stuff in it. So when we think about making copies of that for every single person, what I would do, what I've suggested in the past, is to make a copy that students can access online. You know, they don't get their own copy, but they can see it on their computer and have them read it that way. It's a little bit more work, but then you're not making all those copies. Imagine all the rights holders in like one magazine. You know, so many rights holders are involved in producing a magazine. It's not like you're just infringing on one person's copyright. You might be infringing on 20 people's copyright by making all of those copies. The other thing I tell people to do is look to see if you can find more copies of that magazine on the used marketplace, because sometimes you can. Maybe you only need 3 more copies. Wouldn't that be great? And you find 3 that you can buy and be able to distribute to your students.
For me, an easy explanation is this effect on the market for the work. And it is so obvious because you mentioned the one lawsuit. I think it was a lawsuit, but it's the Dynastudy case. And friends, I did put a link, and boy, I had so strong memories of when this happened. Because the first thing I said is, you know, if you had a librarian in the room, that would have never happened. And, but
I know that was really a very obvious, you know, infringement. And the people were like, you know, threw caution to the wind. I don't care. You know, it was really bad.
Well, and friends, I did put a link in the show notes. If you've not heard of this case, Houston did pay out a settlement of over $9 million because of this number 4. Of course, there's an educational value to the study guides, but the effect on the market of the work, because friends, if you've gone through any car wash in the United States, in one of the things that's populated in like party stores and car washes are these racks of these study guides which across the board, they're sort of in a hard laminate. It's a ready reference tool. If, for whatever you're studying, and it's a study guide, but it's laminated and it's vibrant in colors. And my understanding is that somebody from the district had purchased one, and then in reproducing it for every student in the district, they had cut off the Dynastudy copyright and simply made one, they purchased one copy and then completely published it across a very large district. You could compute the actual number of, according to the value of each one of these study guides, that was now being mass-produced, not by Dynastudy, but by the Houston School District. And it was like, oh, this was easily avoidable.
The Dynastudy people, it was really like a small shop operation. It wasn't like a big publisher or anything. It was like they didn't have very many employees. So it's just like a small group where that kind of infringement was evident immediately because they could see, wow, we're not making this money that we used to be making before from Houston. And it was just the attitude of the people that were making the copies was really, really, disrespectful of the law.
Oh, they posted about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, friends, if you're getting away with something, don't post about it. All right. So, yes, and it was a very small company. So you have a very sympathetic plaintiff in this case.
Really, really.
What should school librarians know about Section 108?
Section 108 is the exception in the law that allows libraries to do many of their mission-critical activities, such as preservation, making copies for users, replacement copies, those kinds of things. It's the exception that says librarians are privileged individuals under the copyright law because we got our own section. Nobody else has their own section like librarians do. So that means we are recognized as being groups of people that are going to be using a lot of information, and we need guidance, and sometimes we're going to make mistakes, but, these people are special. They're teachers. They're teaching people. So we like Section 108 just for the very fact that it does that. But Section 108 is very wordy, and if this is true, then this can be true kind of thing. It's not the easiest part of the law to read. So when I teach about Section 108, when I have taught about it, I kind of just reflect on the fact that there are certain things that librarians do that Section 108 allows under certain conditions. Those same things can be done when you argue fair use, because they are fair uses. Making a preservation copy is a fair use, obviously. No one else is making you a preservation copy. You're not getting a preservation copy from the publisher. You can't buy a preservation copy. Just librarians do that. So this kind of thing is fair. So I kind of tend to ask people to consider fair use more than Section 108, because fair use, regardless of your use, can always be applied. Section 108 really has to do only with reproductions, making copies.
Got it. Yeah, and that sort of came with the advent of the copy machine.
Yes.
And it was a revolutionary. I remember going with my nickels to the library to make copies from the encyclopedia for my research. And that would have been a violation of copyright were it not for Section 108, I imagine. But As a library, the institution, and providing the copy machine, you want to be protected.
The copy machine was it was a big deal. It was like, the internet in a way for that time.
Absolutely. I'm such a fan of digitizing everything the teachers bring in, because I'm hoping that they would share a digital copy rather than print copies.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel this is better because we aren't going through all that paper, and yet sharing digital copies could also be a violation of copyright.
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on. If you're taking something that's analog print and making a digital copy of it and sharing it with students and keeping it in a contained space, like a, password protected website, that's generally okay. If you're making a digital copy from a digital copy, then most likely you're violating contract terms that are associated with that initial digital copy. There's also naturally more rights implicated when you're making copies and putting them in a digital format, because you're distributing them, but you're also displaying them on the screen. It's not just like an individual looking by themselves at a book real close up. It's just boom, there it is. So there might be more rights implicated. But I think when it's print to digital, when it's necessary, when you need it to meet a teaching goal, and when it's contained, in general, that kind of thing I do not think is a violation of copyright. It's much more complicated when you're dealing with digital materials.
So this makes me realize a real personal example. We have a subscription to the New York Times through my school. And because our students haven't all necessarily activated their accounts, we tend to make digital copies, which the teachers then put into our learning management system so the students can access that article while the teacher is including it in their larger lesson.
Yes.
But it reminds me of when I was in college, and friends, I will date myself because halfway through my college experience, all of a sudden our printed course packs became exponentially more expensive. Now, for you youngins and you digital natives, a course pack was a printed copy. It was just like you go to a copy center, which mostly don't exist nearly to the extent that they used to. But on college campuses, we'd go to a Kinko's or a copy center, and they would provide you with all the photocopies of all the articles that your professor wanted you to read. And these could be considerable, but you were paying for which binding you wanted, was spiral bound or what kind of binding, if you wanted cover on it. And then you also paid for the physical copies. But halfway through my college experience, but junior and senior year, all of a sudden we were smacked in the face with these egregious costs. And we're like, what is this? It's just a little course pack. They said, those are royalties to the publisher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you can see why publishers would want to monetize that market. I mean, making copies of a material for everybody, print copies, that eats into your budget. If you could have sold, all of those books instead of, having one article out of those books photocopy and given away essentially for free, that was a problem. And, they were aware of that. And the royalties are high, sometimes really, really high. But sometimes there's also a situation where you're paying for a royalty when if you actually just used that work in an analog environment, it would have been considered fair. You know what I mean? So there was an assumption that every copy made had to be paid for because otherwise it was an infringing copy. Not necessarily. Maybe not. Maybe considering the situation, it was not infringing. And some things you should not pay for permission for public domain materials. That's in the public domain. You should not pay for that. It's open for all of us now that it's in the public domain. Factual material, maps, figures, different mathematical formulas. Those are things that have very, very little copyright protection. And when people try to collect money on that, you kind of go like, I don't know about that one. But who has the time to go through everything in their course pack and go like, well, wait a minute. This one's a public domain material.
I'm thinking of something you raised quite a bit in your book, and it's very relevant to the teachers we support, and those are consumables. Could you explain what consumables are and how that relates to copyright infringement?
Yeah, consumables are products that are meant to be sold to each individual in the class. That is their market. Like these, if you infringed in that market, like they did at the Dyna study, you would have a huge impact on the marketplace because you wouldn't be buying 50 copies, you'd be buying one. Obvious. So consumables is kind of an easy one. If you get a consumable, you should buy a copy for everybody. If you have sheet music, you should have a copy for everybody. Something might happen where you lose a piece of sheet music for the trumpet player. Well, and your performance is like going to happen right now, so you make a copy. That's okay. But to systematically make copies of all the consumables so you don't have to pay for them is obviously very infringing.
Well, I'm thinking about like workbooks that we'd give our students. Like if you buy a workbook, instead of buying every kid in the first grade your handwriting workbook, you buy one and just make copies for the entire district off of that. No.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it gets kind of confusing too because some consumables, they will include additional rules, kind of an unnegotiated license agreement that says, sometimes good things, but it says you can go ahead and make 10 copies of this. Ordinarily you wouldn't be able to, but we know you're going to need more copies than just this, one. So you can make 10. Or the teacher can make a copy. The teacher can have their own extra copy. That's okay. So sometimes you look at the material and you see what the publisher thinks is fair and legitimate. And sometimes it's a boom for librarians. It's really, really, really great.
Could you explain for us the TEACH Act?
The TEACH Act, we got to go back to the olden days. And way, way long ago, the internet happened. And teachers, especially at the university level, were encouraged to use the internet for teaching purposes because there was a market in distance learning that was just beginning to develop. And so teachers and professors, they did do this. They started to digitize material and put them on a rudimentary website, at the very beginning, because they didn't have learning module systems or anything like that then. People said, well, you know what? We're just going to make sure that we follow copyright as if we would in the print world. So if we should get permission, we'll go ahead and get permission. If we shouldn't, we'll just go ahead and make the copy. There was a lot of discussion about how one copy on a computer can really mean millions of copies for everybody if everybody has access to it. So there was kind of a, weird element to it. And I was there when people started to do course websites and people were confused. They didn't know what to do. But they were actually following the law as best as they knew how because there was no exception for the TEACH Act. There was no exception to use materials in a digital classroom. There was only an exception for using materials in a face-to-face classroom. So when the TEACH Act was written, a lot of people say, we don't like it. It's again very, very wordy, and it has a lot of different conditions that one must meet before one can do something and not something. But it really was the early sign that in the digital environment, we're going to have less rights than we do in the analog market. There's license agreements associated with all this digital content. And even if you want to use the TEACH Act, if your digital material that you want to share is under a license agreement, you might be violating that license agreement. Ordinarily, it might have been a fair use under the copyright law, but the license trumps the copyright law, and those are the rules that you have to follow, not rules that you've agreed to, not rules that Congress has decided are fair, but rules that are determined by the publishers and the rights holders of what you can and cannot do. So when the TEACH Act passed, it was oh, thank goodness, we have some guidance for digital classrooms. But at the same time, there are elements of the TEACH Act that told us early on, you have less rights in the digital environment.
Interesting. Carrie, I'm really curious. Lots of my teachers will acquire movies and stream them on their Amazon Prime or another streaming service. Is this a violation of copyright when they do this at school?
It is a violation of the license agreement terms that you agreed to when you signed up for Amazon Prime or some other streaming service. Behind, that little I agree is an agreement. That button, I agree to these terms, is an agreement that you will follow the license terms established by the vendor, Amazon Prime, whoever. So it's really the license agreements that control a lot of the content that we can receive as individuals. So it's the companies that create these products, that offer these products, they don't think that, somebody might want to use this for teaching. They think, I got a subscriber, they're paying $10 a month. Each subscriber agrees to a license agreement that I've established. End of story. So it's not really an infringement of copyright, but it is an infringement of the license agreement. This is a huge issue, and one that I really hoped that could be solved while I still worked for ALA. But what we need is exception in the law that would allow us to still use the rights under copyright that we have with non-negotiated licenses. Kind of just saying like the non-negotiated license for a school institution allows for Section 108, Section 109, Section 110, all of those things that we have under the law, which Congress, in their policy-making position, decided were the best things that should happen. So this is why it's, you buy an iPod, you agree to a license agreement. You turn it on, there's a license agreement there. It's everywhere.
Carrie, I'm curious because every school I've ever worked in has and maintained our swank licenses, and we've kept those current. But in this case, I think that there's some ambiguity because somebody says, my school has a swank license. Therefore, if I make this purchase, what I'm doing is, of course, fine. Or if I'm showing it for a class and this isn't the PTO, which might be raising, money, selling popcorn or concessions. I remember on Facebook, there was this flurry of angry parents who said, we can't show this movie because Disney's going to sue us. And I don't know if it's an urban myth. I don't know if Disney's ever sued a PTO for showing a Disney film, or if that's just legend. But that's the concern, right? We're concerned that somebody is, or maybe we aren't concerned. Maybe the reason why this is so prevalent. A good example is when I was a history teacher and we had VHS tapes and I bought a copy of Glory, which came out in 1989. And it was about a Black regiment fighting in the Civil War. And I would show this in my classroom because in my limited understanding of, copyright violations, I owned the copy to this, VHS. Therefore, I could show it in my classroom without any concern. We just now can stream everything.
There's a couple things going on. Because you went and you purchased Glory, you owned that copy. So you made a purchase in the marketplace. You don't own all the rights to that copy. Those rights still exist with the rights holder. But there are exemptions in the copyright law that allow you to show Glory to your classroom in a face-to-face teaching situation, and maybe in a blended classroom or a digital classroom under certain conditions. So when you have an outright purchase, you have the copyright law. When you have a digital streaming service, you do not have the copyright law. The copyright law is like a stranger, if that makes sense. So a lot of the titles that people are wanting to show in the classroom are only available on Amazon Prime. It's not like you can buy them outright. You can't. You can only license them. So it's a big, big restriction for people who want to use content in the classroom that's current, that people are talking about. So it should be a change in the law.
Absolutely. So Chapter 7, the school has a talent show. I'm learning all about mechanical licenses, and I'm just, my head's spinning. Our schools have music departments, which are accustomed to purchasing sheet music, whether you are an instrumental or you're vocal. There's a school play or a musical. This seems like a real fraught area to be discussing copyright.
It is. And I admittedly know just the basic stuff about music copyright. If you really have a music copyright issue, call a music librarian at a research institution or at a big university. They will know who to call, what to do, whether you need permission. The thing that's complicated about music is that there's a number of rights holders involved. There are rights holders that wrote the music. There are rights holders that made the sound recording. There are rights holders that synced the sound recording to a video. And all of these permissions might need to be collected if you're using music. It's horrible. Music copyright is horrible and completely very, very, very hard to understand. I think that in the marketplace, you have these clearinghouses that, obviously help. You have ASCAP and you have BMI, you have the Harry Fox Agency. They distribute certain licenses for folks. Years ago, they did not really care so much about the school environment. They didn't think there was that much money in there. So really, in the olden days, they didn't even sell licenses to the school market. They really did focus licensing on other markets, for-profit markets and university markets. But now I think they're moving into the school a little bit more. But again, it's a horrible, horrible copyright section, and it's been amended, oh my God, a number of times. And the last amendment, really, it's a killer. It's just a killer.
Well, and again, I know my sister's a music teacher, and I hear a lot about when you purchase the rights to a show and then collecting all the music at the end of the show because you've got to send it back to the publisher. And there's a right way to do this to make sure that you aren't attracting the kind of negative attention that this might happen.
Right. And, people that have to deal with it on a daily basis, they get used to it,
Sure.
But I never had to deal with it on a regular basis.
And the reason why I raise it is because as a school librarian, the copy machine, one of the copy machines is always in my space, which means I know when students are getting ready for their competitions. I know when performances are going to happen because I'm involved in some of that publication materials and those announcements. But I'm also very aware when scripts have to be produced for the plays. And so, yes, I think we happen to be observers of some of this, copying, and it's hard to just turn a blind eye.
Yes, it is.
Yeah,
it is. And these markets, for music, and for motion pictures with music, of course, and videos with music. These are big markets where a lot of money, is exchanged. You scratch my back, I'll scratch your back. You might be getting a license from somebody who tomorrow is going to get a license from you based on what kind of rights you hold to allow a permission. So it's a very expensive market, makes a lot of money. It's like American culture. It's revered. So it's an interesting area to study.
So I'm going to say this on behalf of all the school librarians who are tuning in right now, but copyright issues are very thorny for us because many of us have incredibly precarious job security. If the third grade teacher violates copyright, well, third grade isn't going to become optional. The third grade teacher does not have to worry about them losing their job because somebody feels they're making too many photocopies. If the librarian becomes a real pain in the you-know-what, well, we get replaced by people all the time. We get, removed from our positions. We are oftentimes, substituted out with somebody who's a clerk or a media tech with no training. And so, if we don't feel safe we aren't likely to raise those objections to the flagrant disregard for copyright, which we see often in the copy machines in our spaces, or that we're aware of that's going on in other places in our building. I have oftentimes caught myself saying, isn't there something we can do that doesn't involve photocopying the entire book? It's very hard because we also have to temper that fervor for preserving copyright and also our jobs.
Yes. The school librarians they are in a very precarious position, job security-wise, and it's really wrong. A lot of school librarians have lost their jobs, or they have one school librarian for 10 schools or something like that. It's really bad. I don't think people realize how important a school librarian is. What I do when I see somebody that wants to copy a whole book, I try to engage with that person and say, what is your teaching goal? What are you trying to do? And sometimes when you talk to the person, like do a little reference interview, you find out that they don't really need to copy the entire book. What they really need is like some sections from the book, or they need to buy another copy of that book and put it on reserve in the library. They can still meet their teaching need in ways that don't require, full text copying. So I always try to get the librarian and the teacher to talk to one another, and I know that can be difficult. Depending, everybody's busy, everybody has their job to do. But, what can we do to make your use more lawful than it is if you just photocopy that entire book? What can we do? And try to come up with ways to mitigate that. A digital copy on a learning website that's password protected, that might work, I don't really need all these print copies. Maybe I can put a chapter at a time on this web course. Yeah, that'll work, You don't have to make all the copies. So it's kind of, don't go up to the person and be like, you're committing infringement, you're terrible, blah, blah, blah. But more like, what are you trying to do? I want to help you.
I remember one of my frustrations is I had a teacher who brought in a little pamphlet, and they wanted to make an entire set of these full color pamphlets for their classroom. And I said, isn't there a way we could sort of swap out like the books for what you're trying to teach? And they said, you don't understand, Amy, I'm teaching nonfiction text features and I need to use this pamphlet. And I said, we have many, many books in our collection which all do an exceptional job of highlighting the nonfiction text features that you are trying to teach. Could I just bring this cart of books to you in your classroom? I'm just going to check them out to you, and I'm going to give you a nice little list of all the books that you can have, and you can share those with the students for as long as you need them, because we have books that can do that. Or, Amy, I'm trying to teach this particular part of speech, or I'm trying to teach action verbs. Guess what? We've got fantastic books that teach action verbs. Just whatever it is you're trying to teach, sometimes we can find perfectly, acceptable. And I think what I point to are these kits. All too often, our administration buys in on these kits, which teach certain, sort of criteria that, the second grade needs to teach. And if you just use the kit, then you don't need to do anything else, and it's ready-made and it's turnkey. But we have books which satisfy all of the objectives that you're trying to reach in this sort of prefab boxed curriculum. And I'm just going to say it right now, the librarians need to be in on those curriculum meetings, because if we realize the district doesn't need to buy a kit, we already own the books that will accomplish the same thing.
Yes. And the publications, they're always trying new approaches to expand their market, and that's fair. But yes, if you know that there are alternatives that will work perfectly well that you already have purchased, fantastic.
What about the work that teachers and librarians create? There's always some concern that our districts own our work product while we're on the clock.
Yes. This has to do with who holds the copyright, the school or the teacher. In general, because of the way contracts are written, and because teachers get a salary, and in general, they also get Social Security, benefits, this kind of thing happening, vacation days, it really looks like they work for the school. Everything that they produce is for the school. So, in general, many times, the school does hold your work, the rights to your work. However, sometimes deals are made. Maybe if it's a big issue, you go to the school district says, okay, you can go ahead and use these things when you do conference presentations. You don't have to pay us to use your own lesson plan that you're going to take to a conference presentation. Oh, great, thanks. But there should be concern about who owns what. In general, you don't own it. Sorry to say, in general, you don't. And in a private institution, private school, definitely you don't.
Interesting. I just know that when teams of teachers got together and they wrote curriculum, hey, we took a week of the summer and we all got paid to write curriculum. Newsflash, you don't own that curriculum. And you have no business sharing it out. And you're going to use it in the workplace. But if you're asked to then share it, absolutely. I completely agree with that. And which leads me to teacher pay teacher. And what happens when one of our teachers buys a single lesson, and then we, because we happen to be in the space where the copy machines are, notice that those copies aren't being made for the entire grade level or all the teachers who teach in that department. And we all know if you're on teacher pay teacher, those licenses are single user licenses, not that you can now pass this around to every fifth grade teacher because you bought it, or we're each, I believe, and I'm just going to say right now, I'll throw some teachers under the bus. They said, we take turns buying from teacher pay teacher, so it's fair. Wait, we take turns.
I'm glad you got that worked out.
So it's fair.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, licensing is really, that's our world now. So when you're on teachers pay teachers and you're using that service, you have to follow the rules that they establish. Copyright is a stranger to you there. There is no fair use. Section 108 doesn't exist in a licensing agreement. So when they say single use only, that's what they mean. Now, if you violated that, you wouldn't be committing a copyright infringement. You would be breaking the contract law, which is much less serious, but it's still a violation of the law.
And again, friends, it's hard because when we're standing there and we're looking at a colleague and our colleague's just doing their job. And I said, and sometimes they look at me and they're like, are you kidding me? I paid for this. I'm like, yes, you paid for it. But
I know it's a drag. I mean, perhaps, and this is, the market always steps in and provides services that librarians use, and they're very good services. But I always imagine a world where librarians developed their own services. It wasn't a for-profit kind of situation. It was for sharing learning, because that's our value, to share and to expand knowledge. So if we had created our own teachers pay teachers, we would be in a much better situation. But we didn't. We didn't.
Oh, Carrie. But they're out there. They're out there. They truly are. You know what? You are retired, and I am so grateful that you have shared your time with us. But I hate to break it to you, but there are school librarians who sell on teacher pay teacher. So, but also with the full awareness that once they release those, their work product out there, that is absolutely happening. Mm-hmm. And there's no mystery here that when somebody buys something on teacher pay teacher, what happens next is, unless you follow up, I don't know of any sort of litigation where anybody has been trying to come after the user. But Carrie, I am so grateful. Knowledge is power. And I know that it can feel lonely as librarians trying to avoid copyright infringement, trying to keep our teachers from violating a copyright in our workspaces. I'm so grateful you took time out of your lovely retirement to come back and speak with us. You know, it is really helpful because we're just trying to do the best we can.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's my pleasure to offer any ideas. I like copyright. I mean, I like talking about it. So this was fun for me.
Well, and your book is fantastic. Friends, Complete Copyright for K-12 Librarians and Educators, 2nd edition by Carrie Russell. I hope you have a fantastic day and enjoy the sun.
Okay, thanks very much.
Friends, if you found this episode helpful, please share it out with your team, your PLN, and on social media. Be sure to follow on your favorite podcatcher so you'll never miss an episode. And if you really like listening today, consider leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews help others find us. A couple friendly reminders, friends. Use the code UNITED to take advantage of Capstone's generous $20 discount off an order of $100 or more, and librarians who book their very first Literati Book Fair and mention the code UNITED when booking may qualify to receive a $500 gift card to Titlewave. Use the link in today's show notes and call the Literati team to see if you qualify. Friends, I hope you will consider sending in your voice message and have your say on the very next episode. Visit the link in today's show notes. Join us for our next book club episode when we read Jarred Amato's brand new book, Just Read It. See the link in today's show notes. The topic of our next episode will be Getting Boys Back into Reading and my conversation with Lucas Maxwell. I hope you will tune in.